On a typical day, the 26th of April, 2002, the unthinkable occurred. The Gutenberg Gymnasium in Erfurt, Germany, transformed into a terrifying spectacle. Visualize an average school day, students hustling in the corridors, teachers engrossed in their lesson drafts, and the echoing laughter of youth. Yet, on this day, a dark shadow hung over the Gutenberg Gymnasium. The culprit, a 19-year-old expelled pupil named Robert Steinhauser, took center stage. Steinhauser, a young man burdened with educational failures, had been kicked out for counterfeiting a medical certificate. His expulsion marked the climax in a chronicle of scholastic struggles and clashes with authority. The day twisted into a shattering sequence as Steinhauser, equipped with a Glock 17C and a shotgun, embarked on a lethal spree. The unsuspecting school, which should have been a haven of education, turned into a panorama of pandemonium and dread. The reverberation of gunfire replaced the usual sounds of chalk scratching on blackboards and students' chit-chat. Steinhauser, in his dark wrath, targeted both students and faculty, indiscriminately extinguishing the lives of those in his way. Among those who succumbed to his anger were educators, students, and even a law enforcement officer who answered the distress call. The inconceivable had transformed into a terrifying reality. As the day continued, the magnitude of the disaster amplified. Within approximately 20 minutes, the school was splattered with the blood of 16 innocent souls, each one a heartbreaking casualty. The echoes of the gunshots diminished, but the terrifying memories embedded in the minds of the survivors would endure for years to come. In a brief span of 20 minutes, 16 lives were abruptly ended, marking one of Germany's most somber days. The mastermind behind this chilling act was a 19-year-old expelled student, Robert Steinhauser, who was burdened with a troubled past and a history of confrontations. Steinhauser differed from your typical teenager. His academic life was littered with obstacles and setbacks. Battling to keep pace with his counterparts, he frequently found himself in conflict with the strict structures of the educational system. His incapacity to meet the traditional expectations of academia led to a series of disagreements with educators, further intensifying his feelings of isolation and bitterness. The conflict escalated to a point where Steinhauser found himself resorting to deception, attempting to fabricate a medical certificate. This desperate act ultimately led to his removal from the Gutenberg Gymnasium in Erfurt. This expulsion wasn't just a stain on his academic history, but also a devastating blow to his self-worth, a wound that festered and fueled his rising hatred. In the depths of his despair, Steinhauser ventured into the darkest corners of the internet, where he stumbled upon the gruesome Columbine High School massacre. His study of the tragic event became an obsession, immersing himself in the horrific details. The distorted narrative of the Columbine massacre seemed to echo his own feelings of estrangement and rage. As he plunged further into his research, Steinhauser developed a morbid interest in the weaponry used in the Columbine massacre. He eventually procured a Glock 17C and a shotgun, the same instruments of destruction that he would later employ in his own horrifying act. It's essential to acknowledge that Steinhauser's actions were not impulsive. His plan was methodically orchestrated, with every detail painstakingly considered. He didn't accidentally step into violence. He ventured into it with a calculated determination that was as chilling as it was heartbreaking. Steinhauser, a young man burdened with a tumultuous past, had meticulously orchestrated this horrific act. The massacre transpired during the end-of-year examinations, morphing a place of learning into a terrifying crime scene. On April 26, 2002, the Gutenberg Gymnasium in Erfurt, Germany was filled with a hushed concentration of students engaged in their end-of-year examinations. This scholarly atmosphere was soon to be disrupted by a horrifying act of violence. 19-year-old Robert Steinhauser, a dismissed student, entered his old school not to take an examination but armed with a Glock and a shotgun for retribution. As students grappled with complex problems, Steinhauser targeted the mathematics classroom to begin his assault. With a disturbing tranquility, he shot a teacher before the horrified pupils. The gunshot's echo was a nightmarish exclamation point to an otherwise typical school day. The classroom, once a haven of learning, was metamorphosed into a shocking tableau of brutality. In the midst of pandemonium, one person stood out. Rainer Heise, a teacher at the school, courageously faced Steinhauser. A scenario of extraordinary bravery unfolded as Heise confronted the armed ex-student, ultimately disarming him. It was a face-off that demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit when confronted with peril. However, the day was far from done. In a final act of defiance, Steinhauser turned the gun upon himself. The final gunshot echoed, marking the conclusion of a horrific episode that lasted around 20 minutes, but would leave a lifelong wound on the community. In a final act of defiance, Steinhauser ended his own life, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable terror. In the aftermath of the massacre, Germany was left reeling, and the incident ignited nationwide discussions and reforms. The Gutenberg Gymnasium catastrophe served as a harsh reality check, a chilling reminder of the dangers lurking in the corners of society. The incident triggered a swarm of issues: gun laws, educational policies, and the influence of media violence on the youth. The German government, in reaction, took prompt and decisive steps. The firearm laws, already viewed as strict, were tightened further. The age for legal possession of firearms was increased, and rules regarding their storage were made more rigorous. This conveyed a clear message. The safety of its citizens was the top priority, and every possible measure would be taken to ensure it. On the educational front, policies underwent reassessment. A greater emphasis was placed on student mental health, and initiatives were launched to identify and assist struggling students. Schools were encouraged to create a nurturing environment where every student felt recognized, listened to, and valued. The impact of media violence on shaping young minds was another area that raised concerns. While it is a multifaceted and heated issue, it was evident that more measures were needed to shield children and adolescents from detrimental influences. The incident incited debates on the need for stricter regulations on violent video games and films, illuminating the potentially harmful effects of unrestricted exposure to violent content. But perhaps the most heart-wrenching consequence was the psychological trauma borne by the survivors. Over 700 students were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. For them, the reverberations of that horrific day carried on long after the sound of gunfire had ended. The Thuringian Accident Insurance Fund intervened, offering financial aid to victims and survivors, and ongoing psychological support became a pivotal part of the recovery process. The Erfurt Massacre left a permanent scar on Germany, prompting a reassessment of societal norms and regulations. The tragedy sent a grim message stressing the immediate need for societal reform. It was a call to action that could not be disregarded. In its aftermath, Germany stood united, pledging to improve, to be superior, for the well-being of its future generations. The Erfurt School Massacre, a chilling reminder of life's fragility, continues to influence Germany's policies and perspectives. This terrifying incident was not just a singular tragedy, but it was a catalyst for considerable change, a pivot point that permanently transformed the trajectory of the nation's history. In the aftermath of the massacre, Germany reassessed its firearm laws and tightened regulations to prevent similar instances from recurring. The alterations were comprehensive and significant, a clear indication of the country's dedication to protect its citizens, especially the susceptible youth. The occurrence also ignited a nationwide debate on the impact of violent media on young minds, resulting in heightened scrutiny and restrictions on violent video games. But the implications extended beyond this. The educational system itself was placed under examination, inducing authorities to re-evaluate policies and procedures. Schools started to concentrate more on comprehending and addressing student struggles, cultivating a more supportive and inclusive environment. The significance of mental health was emphasized, resulting in the establishment of sturdy support systems within educational institutions. We cannot ignore the survivors. The massacre inflicted deep psychological wounds on those who experienced it. More than 700 students were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, a grim reminder of the enduring influence of such a traumatic incident. To this day, some survivors continue to avail psychological support, evidence of the long-term effects of the tragedy. Indeed, the Erfurt School Massacre was more than a tragic event. It served as a wake-up call, leading to profound societal changes that continue to shape the nation's policies and perspectives. The reminders of that tragic day still reverberate, reminding us of the importance of understanding and addressing the struggles of our youth.
What propels an ostensibly average adolescent to perpetrate unthinkable acts of aggression? This query constantly haunts our thoughts as we try to unravel the puzzle that is Eric Burrell, a French high school student who stunned the nation with a series of vicious deeds in September 1995. Borel was far from an average adolescent. His existence, filled with adversity from the outset, was tainted by maltreatment and a peculiar fascination with the military. A product of harsh upbringing, he was a silent tempest disguised as an unassuming boy. This peculiar interest in aggression, combined with his tumultuous childhood, sketched a bleak image of a young man on the brink of disaster. His was not a life of playground frolics and adolescent fantasies. Rather, it was an existence that reverberated with the echoes of strife and an increasing obsession with warfare. Amid the unrest, Borel sought refuge in the regimented world of the military, an environment that presented a respite from his tumultuous reality. This fixation was not a harmless diversion, but a perilous attraction that would inevitably engulf him. As time went on, the indicators of his inevitable descent into violence became increasingly apparent. However, these were predominantly disregarded or brushed off as adolescent turmoil. Little did anyone anticipate, these were not just transient adolescent caprices, but harbingers of a catastrophic event. As we probe further into Eric Borel's life, we uncover a disturbing cycle of maltreatment and obsession, a lethal cocktail that resulted in an act of aggression so heinous, it marked one of the blackest periods in French chronicles. A life characterized by adversity and a fixation with brutality, a lethal mix that precipitated a disastrous end. This is the story of Eric Borel, a tale that stands as a stark warning of the catastrophic effects of maltreatment and the perilous attraction of aggression. How does a tranquil Sunday in a quaint French hamlet morph into a horrific bloodbath? We journey back to September 24, 1995. The day began as any other, but little did the serene town of Soulipont know a terror was looming. 17-year-old Eric Borel, a high school student harboring a troubled past and a disturbing interest in the military, unleashed an act of gruesome violence. In a fit of fury, he savagely annihilated his entire family. Using a hammer and a baseball bat, he mercilessly snuffed out the lives of his parents and his 11-year-old brother. However, the bloodbath was only beginning. Finished with the slaughter at home, Borel armed himself with a .22 caliber rifle and launched a deadly spree through the streets of the neighboring hamlet, Cuers. The once tranquil town was soon to metamorphose into a horrific scene. As he strolled the hushed streets, he started randomly gunning down bystanders. Caught off guard, the township plunged into chaos as Borel's shooting spree raged on. Men, women, children, none were spared from his haphazard violence. In the blink of an eye, 12 innocent lives were tragically cut short that day, imprinting a permanent scar on the small town. The blood-curdling spree concluded only when Borel turned the weapon on himself. His reasons remain a chilling mystery that continues to haunt the survivors and the families of the victims. A serene hamlet, permanently marred by the deeds of one deranged individual. In the aftermath of such a calamity, what endures? The small town of Cuers had been consumed by a storm of brutality, leaving its inhabitants in a vortex of terror and dismay. The day subsequent to the rampage, the lanes were ominously silent, as if the township itself was stifling a gasp, wrestling with the magnitude of the events that had occurred. Yet, in the midst of this overpowering silence, the fortitude and resilience of the human spirit began to assert itself. The villagers, while wrestling with the inconceivable, unified in a testament to their strength and solidarity. A makeshift chapel appeared, a beacon of comfort amidst havoc. The villagers congregated, seeking solace in mutual sorrow, their collective lament resonating through the sacred corridors. The injured were transported to nearby hamlets for care, their injuries a grim reminder of the terror that had occurred. Yet, beyond the physical scars, it was the psychological aftermath that posed the greatest healing challenge. Meanwhile, back in the quiet lanes of Cuers, the lifeless remains of Borel's family were found. The grim finding sent another jolt of shock through the town, appending a chilling coda to the already horrifying tale. But as the initial shock gave way to profound sadness, the community rallied. Residents offered their shoulders for their neighbors to shed tears on, their homes for them to seek refuge, their strength for them to depend on. In the face of inconceivable loss, they found comfort in each other, their unity a stark juxtaposition to the solitary figure that had caused such devastation. The calamity that unfurled on that doomed day in September 1995 scarred the hamlet of Cuers forever. Yet, despite the shadows that had fallen, the town refused to be characterized by the darkness. Instead, they chose to remember not the act of brutality, but the act of unifying, of supporting each other, of rising from the ruins. A community fragmented but not defeated. seeking comfort and recovery in the face of unimaginable loss. Confronted with such irrational brutality, one query lingers. Why? As we immerse ourselves into the harrowing depths of the unknown, we wrestle with the puzzling incentives that spurred Erich Borell's actions. The mysteries shrouding this case have spurred a spectrum of conjectures, leaving a community eternally marked. The intricacies of the probe into Borell's case were as labyrinthine as they were baffling. With no definitive proof to shed light, investigators were left threading through a maze of potentialities. What could possibly push a 17-year-old boy to perpetrate such gruesome acts? Was a tumultuous upbringing, characterized by maltreatment and an abnormal fascination with the military, the catalyst for his behavior? Adding to the puzzle were hushed rumors of fascist leanings that further complicated the situation. Could political ideology have played a role, or were these mere conjectures trying to piece together an unfathomable calamity? The truth remained veiled, obscured in the fog of doubt. And then, there were the familial dynamics. The relationships within the Borell residence were anything but typical, which only contributed to the complexity of the investigation. The remains of Borell's family were located post the shooting spree, an unsettling detail that introduced another facet to the enigma. Was this an act of retribution, a desperate plea for assistance, or an expression of ingrained hostility? As we rummage through the shards of evidence, we uncover a mosaic of theories, each more baffling than its predecessor. Yet none offer a conclusive explanation for the bone-chilling incidents that transpired on that fateful day in September 1995. The relentless quest for answers persists, an unending pursuit of comprehension amidst a sea of queries. As we probe further into the abyss, we are reminded of the intricacy of the human mind, the tangled web of thought processes, emotions, and experiences that dictate our actions. A query that continues to haunt Cuers to this day, a stark reminder of the enigma that was Erich Borell. How does a society progress after such a horrific incident? This question has hovered over Cuers, France for almost 30 years, following the dreadful deeds of Erich Borell. The enduring impact of the tragedy on Cuers and its inhabitants is undeniable. It's deeply ingrained in the town's history like an unremovable mark. The rampage forced the society to face harsh truths about violence and mental health. It served as a stark warning that these issues are indifferent to location, age, or financial standing. In its aftermath, mindsets changed, dialogues progressed, and consciousness increased. The people of Cuers, with their tenacity, converted the anguish into a plea for better comprehension of mental health and more effective prevention strategies. Their experience stands as a testament to the human ability to find hope in the bleakest of situations. A tragic event that irrevocably altered a community, reminding us of the significance of understanding and tackling the origins of violence.
What drives a person to the brink to commit such heinous acts against their fellow beings? Today we explore a horrifying event that sent shockwaves across the globe. The date was September 23, 2008. The setting, Kauhajoki University of Applied Sciences in Kauhajoki, Finland. A day that began ordinarily with students entering their classrooms, ignorant of the fact their lives were on the verge of permanent alteration. The architect of the mayhem was a 22-year-old student, Matti Juhani Saari. Don't be deceived by the seemingly tender age. This was not an impressionable young man swept up in a fleeting moment of fervor or a poorly judged joke gone awry. This was a premeditated act of brutality, planned meticulously over 6 years. Armed with a semi-automatic pistol, a Walther P22 target and Molotov cocktails, Saari's intentions were clear, and his loathing for mankind was tangible. His actions that day led to the untimely end of 10 innocent lives before he turned the weapon on himself. A majority of the victims, tragically, were women. However, it wasn't a misogynistic sentiment that ignited Saari's actions. His motive, as far as anyone could discern, was a deep-seated contempt for mankind. This wasn't merely an instance of a solitary individual retaliating. This was the second school shooting in Finland in less than a year, a grim reminder of the hidden darkness within society. This horrifying event marked a sorrowful repetition of history. The orchestrator of this terror, Matti Juhani Saari, was a mere 22 years old, a pupil at the very institution he would later wreak havoc upon. Saari was not an alien entity within the school. He was a recognized individual, a colleague who navigated the same corridors, occupied the same study halls, and pursued the same academic path as those he would later terrorize. Saari was one amongst them, yet he carried an unfathomable and absurd hatred for mankind that was out of line with his seemingly typical student life. Sari's selection of armament was deliberate and effective. He armed himself with a Walther P-22 target, a semi-automatic pistol and Molotov cocktails, weapons capable of inflicting widespread damage and mayhem. These were not arms picked up in haste. They were procured with a specific intent, a testament to Sari's mentality and premeditated purpose. Most alarmingly, Sari had been devising this carnage for a chilling 6 years. This was not a spur-of-the-moment act of violence, but a meticulously planned assault that had been brewing for half a decade. It's a grim reminder that behind the vilest acts often lies a level of planning and forethought that is as shocking as the act itself. Even though a majority of his victims were female, Sari's motive didn't seem to stem from misogyny. Rather, it was a more general, more pervasive disdain for humanity that propelled him to commit this horrifying act. This indiscriminate loathing makes his actions all the more difficult to understand. Sari's unfathomable loathing for mankind was tragically unleashed upon his unsuspecting peers. In the era of the internet, Sari left a haunting digital trail. It was a foreboding precursor to the impending disaster. The signs were obvious, carved in the pixels of the online realm, an eerie introduction to the terror that was about to unravel. Sari, a 22-year-old scholar, had shared disturbing videos on YouTube, a platform celebrated for its broad reach and assorted content. He was observed discharging a firearm, an exhibition of dominance, and an unspoken plea for recognition. This act of virtual violence did not go unnoticed. Law enforcement was notified about these unsettling uploads. They sprang into action, questioning Sari, assessing the profundity of his motives, attempting to compute the danger he presented. An intervention was made, a stride towards impeding disaster. Yet the system was incapable of restraining him. Despite the disturbing videos, despite the indirect threats, his firearm permit was not rescinded. A deficiency of substantial evidence, they claimed. This serves as a grim reminder of the intricacies of forecasting human conduct, of assessing the gravity of a threat from digital traces. It prompts doubts about the efficiency of our systems, of our capacity to react to warning signals. Sari's digital trail was a signal, a cautionary note that was not appropriately attended. His disturbing videos were not just a reflection of his mental state, but a forecast of his future conduct. The calamity that occurred later was not a solitary act of aggression, but the climax of a sequence of disregarded alarms, of lost chances to mediate. It serves as a teaching of the significance of vigilance in the internet age, of the necessity to consider every threat seriously, to delve beneath the surface and comprehend the depths of a person's motives. The virtual world mirrored Sari's sinister intentions, but the image was not lucid enough to avert the catastrophe. The reverberations of the gunfire had scarcely subsided when Finland was engulfed in a day of sorrow. In the aftermath of the Kauhajoki school shooting, the nation found itself wrestling with the unthinkable. 10 lives cut short, a community in pieces, and a country asking how such a catastrophic event could happen within its borders. Prime Minister Matti Vanhanen immediately declared a day of national sorrow, an expression of shared grief and unity with the bereaved families, the students of the Kauhajoki University of Applied Sciences, and the citizens of Kauhajoki. It was a day of quiet reflection, as the country lamented the victims and sought explanations for the violence that had happened. However, amidst the mourning and shock, a rising wave of examination and anxiety was forming. Queries were raised about Finland's firearm regulations, which had enabled the young 22-year-old student, Matti Juhani Sari, to lawfully own the Walther P-22 target semi-automatic pistol he used in the massacre. Finland, notorious for its high rate of civilian gun ownership, suddenly found itself in harsh scrutiny. The debate on gun control escalated. Critics favoured tighter regulations, while others defended the right to bear arms. The nation was tangled in a grave discussion about the equilibrium between individual liberty and societal safety. The incident also initiated a nationwide discourse on mental health support. Sari had revealed a deep-rooted loathing for mankind, yet his troubling mindset had been overlooked or untreated. Education facilities and health services were compelled to re-evaluate their policies and procedures, aiming to offer enhanced support and intervention for individuals in crisis. The school shooting stands as a bleak reminder of the havoc a single individual can wreak, prompting questions about firearm regulations and mental health provisions. It's a chilling echo that continues to resonate, prompting us to consider the steps we take to shield our societies and assure the well-being of every person. Grim true crime narratives such as these compel us to scrutinize our society, our legislation, and our capacity for empathy. As we plunge into the ominous depths of the Kauhajoki school shooting, we grapple with a storm of disquieting queries. Matti Juhani Saari, a young man of only 22 years, nurtured a hatred so deep that it conducted an unspeakable catastrophe. Saari meticulously planned this massacre for half a decade, his animosity brewing beneath the surface. He was not propelled by a specific grudge against women, despite the majority of victims being female. Rather, he was driven by a broader, deeply troubling resentment towards mankind. These grim truths compel us to ponder on the ramifications of this episode. Finland, a country renowned for its high civilian gun ownership, was cast into the limelight just 1 year after the Jokela High School shooting, and its firearm regulations were subjected to rigorous scrutiny. The incident ignited a discourse that reached beyond Finnish borders, questioning the availability of firearms to the common man. But it's not solely about firearms, right? It's about the mental health support, or the glaring absence of it. The event exposes a shocking deficiency in our comprehension and management of mental health concerns. It highlights the urgent necessity for vigilance, for empathy, for extending a hand to those in distress. It reiterates the gravity of not just observing but recognizing the cautionary signs, of not just heeding but understanding the muted pleas for aid. The Kauhajoki school shooting isn't merely a tale of a crime, it's a tale of societal downfall. It's a narrative that underscores the pressing need for us to challenge, to comprehend, and to respond. To make sure that those who are struggling are not abandoned in the darkness, and that they receive the support they require before they cross the line of despair. As we commemorate the victims of the Kauhajoki school shooting, we are reminded of the pressing need for vigilance, comprehension, and action.
An idyllic, serene village in Scotland, Dunblane, was abruptly propelled into the global spotlight on March 13, 1996. On this day, an inconceivable calamity unfolded, one that would forever change the course of history and spark a nationwide debate on firearm legislation. In the quiet hours of a typical school day, Thomas Hamilton, a man with a tainted reputation and a history of inappropriate behavior towards children, walked into Dunblane Primary School. With a heart void of compassion and a mind clouded by bitterness from rejection, he embarked on a mission of terror. In the school's gymnasium, filled with the innocent laughter and chatter of children, Hamilton opened fire. He ruthlessly claimed the lives of 16 young pupils and their devoted teacher. Their dreams, their potential, and their futures were abruptly and tragically extinguished. The horrifying act lasted no more than a few minutes, but its impact and its shockwaves would reverberate through time. Once the gruesome act was completed, he then ended his own life, leaving behind a scene of unthinkable carnage and a community shattered, plunged into a chasm of grief and disbelief. Parents, who had kissed their children goodbye that morning, expecting to see their smiling faces at the end of the school day, were instead met with a nightmarish reality. The Queen, the Prime Minister, and the leader of the opposition, along with the rest of the world, expressed their shock and called for greater school security and stricter gun control. The incident raised profound questions about how such a calamity could occur and what could be done to prevent it in the future. The gruesome rampage, which lasted only a few minutes, left a once peaceful community in devastation. Dunblane, a village that signified tranquility, would now forever be recognized as the site of an inconceivable calamity. Behind every atrocity, there's a culprit. In this case, it was Thomas Hamilton. Prepare yourself as we dive into the life of Thomas Hamilton, the man behind the Dunblane Massacre. The incident that shook Scotland, and indeed the world, was not a random act of violence, but the result of a long history of concerning behavior. Hamilton was a controversial figure, a disgraced former scoutmaster with a tormented history. He had been involved in boys' clubs, institutions that should be safe spaces for young minds to grow. But under Hamilton's watch, these places became grounds for his unseemly conduct towards children. His obsession with small boys was not a secret. It was known, disturbing, and yet not enough to prevent the tragedy that was to come. Hamilton's bitterness stemmed from rejection. rejection from the society that saw his actions as inappropriate, and rejection from the institutions that had once trusted him. This rejection did not lead to introspection or remorse on Hamilton's part. Instead, it fueled a bitterness that was terrifying in its intensity. His response was not to correct his behavior, but to punish those he believed had wronged him. Hamilton's life was marred by troubling behavior and disturbing obsessions. But perhaps the most concerning aspect of this whole story is that despite his background and the red flags, Hamilton was allowed to lawfully own guns. The question that lingers in the wake of the Dublin Massacre is not just who Thomas Hamilton was, but also how a man like him was allowed to slip through the cracks of the system. How a man with such a past was allowed to possess the means to carry out such a horrific act. This man, with a history of concerning behavior, was allowed to lawfully own guns. The Dublin Massacre sent reverberations not just through the town, but across the whole of UK. In the immediate aftermath of this unthinkable tragedy, the nation found itself in a state of shock and mourning. The Queen, Prime Minister, and leader of the opposition, the very pillars of the UK's leadership, were quick to express their profound sorrow and shock. Their reactions echoed the sentiments of a nation grappling with the horror of what had transpired in the quiet town of Dublin. Yet it was not just an outpouring of grief. In the face of this unimaginable loss, there was a collective call to action. There was a pressing need to ensure that such a tragedy would never befall the country again. The primary focus of this call to action: greater school security and stricter gun control. The country's representatives were not silent on this matter. They acknowledged the urgent need to re-evaluate the country's policies on gun ownership. They recognized that the safety of the UK's children, the future of the country, could not be compromised. And so, a countrywide discussion on gun ownership began, spurred by the tragedy that had befallen the small town of Dublin. The Scottish Secretary and Shadow Scottish Secretary expressed deep sorrow, their sentiments mirroring the heartache that gripped the nation. The Queen, in her wisdom and compassion, conveyed her sympathy to the affected families, their loss resonating with the whole country. The aftermath of the Dublin Massacre was not just a time of mourning. It was a time of reflection and change. It was a time when the nation stood together, united in their grief and their resolve to ensure the safety of their children. The tragedy had shaken the nation to its core, prompting a countrywide discussion on gun ownership. In the wake of the catastrophe, the people of Britain united in solidarity and a call for change. This rallying cry culminated in the Snowdrop Campaign, a movement advocating for stricter gun laws in the United Kingdom. The campaign, named after the delicate white flower that blooms in the harsh winter months, symbolized the resilience and hope that emerged from this dark period. Snowdrop Campaign was a community-led initiative that began in the immediate aftermath of the Dublin Massacre. It was driven by ordinary citizens, many of them parents and teachers, who were determined to ensure that no other community would have to endure a similar catastrophe. The campaign mobilized thousands across the country, who flooded lawmakers with snowdrop petitions. They demanded an absolute prohibition on private ownership of handguns, not just a restriction on calibers above .22. The sea of snowdrops was impossible to ignore, and the British government was compelled to respond. In response to the Snowdrop Campaign, the government passed new legislation banning the private ownership of handguns above .22 caliber. This was a significant victory for the campaigners, but they didn't stop there. They continued to advocate for stricter gun control laws, pushing for an absolute prohibition on all handguns, regardless of the caliber. The Snowdrop Campaign is a testament to the power of collective action. It is a story of ordinary people, fueled by grief and determination, effecting extraordinary change. It is a poignant reminder that even in the face of immense catastrophe, it is possible to forge a path towards a safer future. The Dublin Massacre, a tragic event, ultimately led to a significant decrease in gun-related deaths in the country. The Snowdrop Campaign, born out of this catastrophe, serves as a beacon of hope and a powerful testament to the strength of the human spirit. It is a story of resilience, of a community that turned their grief into action, and a nation that chose to say, never again. While the Dublin Massacre will forever be a gloomy episode in British history, it also represents a pivotal moment. This pivotal moment led to significant and impactful changes in the UK's firearm legislation. The Dublin Massacre was a wake-up call that echoed through the halls of power, stirring the conscience of a nation. The public clamor that followed the tragedy was deafening. It was a call to action, a demand for change, and it was a call that was heard. In response to the massacre, the British government launched an inquiry into gun control laws, leading to the enactment of the Firearms Amendment Act 1997. This legislation banned private ownership of handguns above .22 caliber. It was a monumental step. It meant that the tools that had enabled such an unimaginable act of violence would no longer be readily available. It was a decision that placed the safety of the public above the rights of gun owners. It was a choice that prioritized lives over liberties, and the impact of this choice was significant. Following the implementation of the Firearms Amendment Act, there was a marked decrease in gun-related deaths in the UK. This was not a mere coincidence. It was a direct consequence of the changes in legislation. The story of Dunblane is therefore not only one of tragedy but also of transformation. It stands as a testament to the power of collective action in the face of adversity. It serves as a reminder that even in our darkest hours, there is always the potential for change. In the aftermath of the Dunblane massacre, the people of Britain did not succumb to despair. They chose to act. They chose to make a difference. They chose to ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again. In the face of unimaginable tragedy, the people of Britain chose action, leading to a more secure tomorrow for all. The 7th of November 2007, a date forever imprinted in Finland's chronicles, not for a celebratory occasion, but for a calamity that rocked the country. Imagine this, an ordinary school day at Jokela High School in Tuusula, Finland. The school is alive with the hum of students engaged in their typical routines. The air is thick with the anticipation of another commonplace day of learning, breaks, and familiar schoolyard camaraderie. In the midst of this everyday scene is one particular student, Pekka Erik Alvinen. On the surface, he is simply one of the many, an unobtrusive figure who blends into the backdrop of uniformed teenagers. However, beneath this seemingly ordinary exterior, there lies a sinister secret. Alvinen is not merely another face in the crowd. He is a living catastrophe, a dark storm cloud disturbing the otherwise tranquil day. His heart harbors dangerous ideologies, a thirst for violence that has found expression in disturbing online videos. This malevolent undercurrent runs stark against the backdrop of an otherwise normal school day. As the day advances, the teachers launch into their lessons. The school resounds with the recognizable sounds of a standard academic day, but beneath it, an unsettling sense of dread begins to swell. The students, unaware of the looming disaster, are in their world of studies, friendships, and teenage aspirations. They continue with their daily routine, oblivious to the tragedy about to befall them, a tragedy that will leave their lives forever altered. As students filled the classrooms, little did they know, their day was set to spiral into a nightmare. On November 7, 2007, a heinous act of violence thrust the peaceful town of Tuusula, Finland, into the international limelight. 18-year-old Pekka Erik Alvinen initiated his premeditated massacre at Jokela High School, which was once a place of comfort and learning for him. Armed with a semi-automatic pistol, he set his plan into motion. Alvinen, who was known to be a shy and usually bullied student, had a calculated plan of destruction. His victims weren't chosen out of chance, rather, a cold-blooded determination. When those students and staff found themselves in his line of fire, their lives were extinguished in moments. The swift and ruthless attack claimed the lives of 2 young girls, 5 boys, and the school's headmistress. The sound of gunfire disrupted the peace, irreversibly transforming the daily school routine and the lives of the survivors. Into the 8 lives tragically claimed that day, 10 others were wounded, left bearing the physical and psychological scars of Alvinen's reign of terror. As the clock counted down the hours, the educational institution transformed from a sanctuary of knowledge and friendship to a grim crime scene. Every classroom, every corridor was touched by the gruesome reality of the massacre. The joy and education that once echoed through the school was replaced by a chilling silence, broken only by the grim task of the first responders. This catastrophic event, deeply inscribed into Finland's history, stands as a harsh admonition of the tragic repercussions of uncontrolled rage and despair. A horrifying act of brutality, committed by a single person, forever altered the trajectory of numerous lives. The school, once vibrant with laughter and learning, was now a tableau of terror and pandemonium. In the aftermath of the shooting, the nation was engulfed in shock and sorrow. The quiet town of Tuusula, once known for its peaceful landscapes, was suddenly submerged into a state of emergency. Emergency services sprung into action, their sirens cutting through the thick silence that had blanketed the school. The police patrols were the first on scene, their primary mission being to secure the premises and ensure the safety of the remaining students and staff. The medical units followed closely after, their trained eyes scanning the scene for any signs of life amidst the turmoil. As they navigated the fear and loss-stained corridors, they attended to the wounded and offered solace to the grief-stricken individuals. The evacuation process promptly commenced, guiding both students and staff, some injured, some unscathed, but all deeply traumatized, away from the school. In the midst of the pandemonium, the shooter, Pekka Erik Auvinen, was discovered lifeless. Auvinen, a shy student who once walked unnoticed through the halls of Jokela High School, had etched his name into the annals of history in the most heart-rending way. He had succumbed to a self-inflicted gunshot wound, ending the violent rampage but leaving behind a myriad of unanswered questions. A day intended for learning had morphed into a scene of devastation, plunging a nation into mourning. The aftermath of the Jokela High School shooting stands as a chilling reminder of life's fragility and the profound effect one individual can have on a community. The echoes of this tragedy are still felt today, serving as a grim reminder of the senseless violence that can morph an ordinary day into a nightmare. Behind this act of terror lay a disturbed mind with a perturbing ideology. We delve deeper into the transformation of the perpetrator, Pekka Erik Auvinen, from a reticent student to an extremist. This was not a fleeting moment of madness, but a meticulously crafted blueprint forged by a disturbed psyche. Originally delineated as a reticent, introspective learner, Auvinen was frequently subjected to schoolyard torment, forcing him further into solitude. His refuge was found in the faceless world of the internet. However, it was within this cybernetic realm that his sinister thoughts found fertile ground and began to thrive. His digital persona was in stark contrast to the lonely learner known to his classmates. He started to espouse radical ideologies, a yearning for violence and a scorn for society. YouTube became his soapbox, his stage to propagate his perturbing beliefs. He was no longer a quiet pupil. He had transformed into a radical extremist, amplifying his ideologies to a worldwide audience. The seriousness of his intentions was underscored when he legally acquired a firearm a month prior to the attack. A teenager without any previous criminal record was now in possession of a weapon. What could propel a young man, in the prime of his life, down such a bleak path? His actions were not impetuous. Rather, they were deliberate, premeditated, and carried out with cold-blooded precision. This was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence, but the end result of a journey down a dark path, one that commenced with harassment and solitude, and culminated in a horrifying bloodbath. The motive behind the madness appears to be a complex interweaving of suffering, isolation, and extremist ideologies, gradually intertwined over time. A blend of circumstances resulted in a catastrophic event, indelibly inscribing the name Pekka Erik Auvinen into the pages of true crime history. A quiet student had transformed into a violent extremist, leaving a trail of questions in his wake. The Jokela school shooting, a stark reminder of humanity's dark underbelly. The tragic incident shook Finland, a peaceful nation that prides itself on its high standard of living. The massacre disrupted this tranquility and rattled the societal norms. The incident brought to the fore the issues surrounding firearm ownership. Finland, known for having one of the highest rates of firearm ownership in the world, was suddenly thrust into a grim confrontation with the implications of its liberal firearm legislation. It was an alarming revelation that an 18-year-old could lawfully acquire a semi-automatic pistol, which stirred a countrywide discourse. The tragedy underscored the perils associated with the right to bear arms, especially when they end up in the wrong hands, leading to a devastating loss of innocent lives. However, the concerns extended beyond just firearm regulation. The incident also emphasized the dangers of online radicalization. Pekka Erik Auvinen, the culprit behind the massacre, had shared graphic videos on YouTube prior to the tragedy, articulating extremist ideologies and a call for violence. This exposed the risks linked to unchecked online content and the susceptibility of young minds to violent tendencies. In the wake of the horror, Finland was plunged into introspection. What preventive measures could have been taken? What were the lapses? Pondering over these questions led to considerable shifts in the country's stance on safety, firearm regulation, and mental well-being of youth. The lessons drawn were severe and distressing. The incident acted as a trigger for stricter firearm regulations, improved monitoring of online content, and heightened focus on mental health support for the young. Schools nationwide responded by enforcing stricter safety measures and bolstering efforts to combat bullying, acknowledging its role in Auvinen's descent into violence. The Jokela school shooting was undeniably a catastrophe, a gloomy chapter in Finland's history. However, it also marked a turning point. a moment of introspection that catalyzed change. It was a stark reminder of the significance of vigilance, the need for regulation, and the indispensable role of mental health support in our society.